Alrighty, good morning, everybody. We would like to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our May Green Breakfast. We're having a really interesting topic today, so I'm very excited to share this with you. And here I'll go ahead and introduce our special guest, who's going to be talking on coexisting with beavers, a dam-worthy challenge. Alison Zak is an anthropologist and environmental educator who founded the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund to educate the public about the benefits of coexisting with beavers and to provide resources and financial support to address human-beaver conflict using non-lethal management strategies. This talk will discuss why beavers matter and what people can do to address flooding and tree chewing problems that they can cause. So without further ado, I will go ahead and stop sharing so instead we can see the presentation and lovely smiling face of our presenter.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to speak to this group on this lovely Saturday morning, and thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. We are going to chat, just like she said, about coexisting with beavers and maybe the reasons why we should do that and how to do that. And we kind of already had a little intro, but just a little bit more about me. So I do have 2 degrees in anthropology, and before I came to beavers, I was actually focusing on the conflict between people and monkeys. So in grad school, I studied an endangered species of macaque that lives on one island in Indonesia, and those monkeys were raiding farmers' crops. And so that was kind of the human-wildlife conflict that I was focused on in my pre-beaver life. And then after my research, after my master's degree, I went into environmental education and worked at the Potomac Valley Audubon Society, the National Zoo, the Clifton Institute, and it was at the Clifton Institute that I started to learn about beavers. So they have a beautiful 900 acres outside of Warrenton, Virginia, and they had an active beaver colony. And I just started to learn all about them and just became more and more intrigued and impressed with their behaviors, the changes that they made to the land, and then the rest was history, you would say. I like to joke that the beavers, they filled a monkey-sized hole in my heart because there were no beavers here, obviously, in North America. And then I founded the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund almost a year ago now. So as Ashley also said, the mission of this organization is to educate people about the benefits of coexisting with beavers. We do that for all ages, and to provide resources and financial support, that's through a cost share program, so that landowners, land managers can address the problems that beavers admittedly cause without trapping and killing the beavers, if at all possible. And our geographic focus is here in Virginia, into West Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. for now. So one of the things that I did before kind of starting this organization was to study what existing organizations are out there doing the same kind of work. And there are a handful, and they are scattered throughout the country. But there was really nothing here in the Mid-Atlantic area or here to support specifically landowners in this region. And we have plenty of beavers, so there was a hole there, and that is why I founded HBCF. Before we get any further, here's a little pop quiz. Which one is the beaver? Time and time again, when I speak with audiences and when I speak one-on-one with landowners and just anyone really, the very first trick to figuring out kind of what your past experience with beavers has been is to figure out if you have actually seen a beaver or one of the many beaver lookalikes that we also coexist with. And so here on this slide, you might be kind of investigating each animal, and I will tell you right now that it is a trick question, so none of these are beavers, but we are going to just quickly go over what other animals we are looking at here that you might see and think that you've seen a beaver, and kind of the quick little ID tricks. So of course, this one here in the middle is a platypus. This one comes up more when I am teaching children about beavers. There's always the comparison to the platypus, which is great because they have those same kind of webbed back feet. It's a mammal that swims in the water, but of course we don't have platypuses here. So I just like to throw that one in there. But then from the bottom right here, this is a river otter. So they may also be in the same ponds as beavers, swimming around, eating completely different things, and moving through the water quite differently. This one here is a groundhog, which all of us have probably seen. They're by the roads. They get hit, unfortunately, by cars. But these guys, they don't live as close to water as beavers do. So they're more underground, in burrows and holes, farther from ponds than beavers would be. This is a mountain beaver, so it actually has beaver in the name, but it's very distantly related to the North American beaver that we're talking about today. Those live out west. We don't have those in this area. This is the nutria. So you can tell from these long white whiskers here that it is not a beaver, although it looks very similar. That is a non-native species from South America that is around, although I'm not sure if they're into Northern Virginia yet, but definitely in other parts of the state. And then finally, probably the trickiest one is this muskrat here on the bottom left. And I did cut off the tail on purpose because if you are able to get a glimpse of the tail, that's the surefire way of distinguishing a muskrat from a beaver. So of course, beavers have those flat tails. Muskrats have a little rat-like tail, which as they swim kind of undulates back and forth in the water. So now that we have ruled out all of those other critters, let's learn about some of the beaver basics here before we dive in deeper. If you look at the range map here on the center of the screen, you can see that beavers live almost in the entire North America. And I'm just going to run through some of the basics here. You can see that this is my version of Unscience an Animal. That was kind of like a trend on the internet a few years ago, where you point out all of the features of the animal in a fun, less scientific way. So the Latin name of the North American beaver is Castor canadensis. There is one other species in the genus called Castor fiber. They live in Europe and Asia. They're very similar looking and very similar in kind of their ecological role. They are in the rodent family. They live in little family groups, which are usually called colonies. So that is going to include a mated pair of a male and a female, and then their offspring, potentially up to even 3 generations, usually only 2. The kits are the baby beavers, which are born right about this time of year. And that is also the time of year that the 2-year-old beavers disperse and find their own habitats. But the yearlings, those year-old beavers that were born the previous spring, they do continue to live in the colony and help raise the kits. And the lifespan of the beavers is about 10 to 20 years in the wild. They can live a little bit longer than that in captivity. And predators of the beavers here in our area could be coyotes, bobcats, black bears, and then one of the things that people forget about a lot are those larger raptors. And that's something that can even take, a young beaver from the water, let's say. So we'll see even more in a little bit why that water is so important to beavers. They are herbivores, so they eat lots and lots of different species of vegetation, lots of different parts of those plant species. And they do not eat fish, which is one of the myths that I'm constantly busting about beavers. If you suppose that there is a mammal in your pond eating all of your fish, it is likely an otter, not a beaver. And then, of course, one of the main things that we all think of with beavers is that they build dams and lodges. So these are the two structures. The first one that they're going to usually build is the dam, because they're going, unless of course there is a person-made dam already there. The dam is what is going to stop the water and back it up so that they have a pond that is preferably at least 3 feet deep for them to be able to dive under the water and escape all of those land predators that we just talked about. And the lodges are, of course, the structures that they build after they've got a nice pond, a spot to live, and that's the structure that they actually live inside of and snooze for most of the day. Because they are crepuscular, nocturnal, although if you see them out during the day, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a weird thing. Animals tend to not get the hint that we've called them nocturnal, so they kind of do whatever they want, right? And then it's worth mentioning that beavers don't always build either one of these structures. So like I said, if there's a man-made dam, they will take advantage of that and have a pond without the maintenance of a dam. And they don't always build lodges either. So in the case of some of the beavers that live on larger rivers like the Shenandoah or the Potomac, they might actually have bank dens or little burrows on the side of the bank instead of building a big lodge of sticks and mud. So those are our Beaver Basics. And I will pause right here and just check the chat for questions, because we're going to move into a slightly different topic. Let's see.
We haven't had any questions, but Deirdre said that she knows that river otters unfortunately killed several kits out at Huntley Meadows Park a year or so ago.
Yes, that is, I didn't know that happened, but yes, Huntley Meadows is a great place to see a lot of the animals that I showed on the previous slide, including beavers. I'm going to stand up here and grab a book that I have. The beavers and the otters and how they kind of get along with each other is something that I talk a lot about. It's something that's really interesting to a lot of people, including children. There is this great children's book called Beaver and Otter Get Along, ... sort of. And it says a story of grit and patience between neighbors. And it's true. It's, beavers and otters, they're native to this area. They share the same habitat. They're not competing for food resources necessarily, but it is true that otters prey on beaver kits, and it happens sometimes. And something that I should have put in this presentation, and I actually have camera trap photos from my time out at the Clifton Institute, where it's 3 photos in quick succession, so just kind of like a second apart of, and the camera, I should say, was facing directly at a beaver lodge. And it's a picture of a blurry otter, butt, I should say, running away from the camera. And then in the second photograph, there's a beaver head in the corner of the frame, and then kind of like what I assume from these 3 photos is that the beaver is actively chasing the otter away from its lodge. So yes, that's just one of those interactions between species that might happen at the beaver pond. All right, so let's see. Here we go. Very briefly, just so that we kind of are understanding the current beaver population in kind of the trend over time, lots of time. This is a timeline of how that population has changed. 1 million years ago is just kind of an arbitrary number, but from before the fur trade in North America, estimates range from anywhere between 60 and 400 million beavers on the continent. This picture up in the top left corner of the screen is Castoroides, which was basically a giant ancestor to the beaver that we have today. And it was the size of a black bear. And I've read about it that it kind of had this ecological role of a hippo, so this giant herbivore. And those only went extinct, from what we can tell, about 10,000 years ago. So actually, Castor canadensis and Castoroides would have coexisted. And then, of course, in the 1600s, the fur trade was kind of ramping up, and at the height of that, so it kind of started to peter out in the 1800s, mid 1800s. But the estimates are that the population crashed to only 100,000 beavers at that time. Beaver pelts were essentially considered currency, and because of the nature of beaver fur, they were felted and made into any number of designs of these hats that you can see in this image here. Today, we are back up to somewhere around, and no one knows for sure, but the estimates are between 10 and 15 million beavers that are in North America today. And what I like to tell landowners is to kind of think about it like, so obviously we're never going to get back to a place where we have 400 million beavers in North America, because that habitat is no longer available, a lot of it. But we can still think about the fact that beaver populations are still, in a way, increasing and still rebounding from the fur trade today. So let's move into why beavers matter. And admittedly, I am not a hydrologist. This part of the whole beaver human thing is not my expertise. But it is really important to understand that the beavers and their behaviors and the structures that they create, they have this very large impact on the landscape. And while sometimes I think we can get really focused on what the problems are with that, and there are problems, we will get there soon. One of the things that is very important to our organization is sharing why beavers matter and why those changes they make can actually benefit us, can benefit other species, and can benefit the landscape. So we're going to start with talking about those beaver dams, and you have a couple of pictures here of some dams that I have seen. I think this one is in Canaan Valley in West Virginia, and then this one is actually from the Clifton Institute. And the dams, so when we think about beavers creating wetlands, to create these ponds, to create safe places for them to live, we can think about it very simply by just them slowing down the flow of water and spreading it out over a larger area. They slow it down, they spread it out. And so the beaver dam's role in that is, of course, to create a pond, is what's helping to spread that water out and slow it down. And the dams themselves act kind of like a giant water filter. So they're going to slow down sediment flowing downstream. They're going to filter out some of the pollutants in the water, reduce the silt load, and just kind of generally improve water quality. They also help to, in kind of slowing down the flow of the water and regulating stream flow, they help to restore streams and the vegetation along streams. They help to reduce erosion. And so these are some of the benefits of the beaver dams. And of course, it's worth saying that, this is something that those larger river beavers, not the beavers are larger, the rivers are larger, they might see kind of fewer of these benefits, but then more of others. So then we talk about the ponds themselves that are created by the beaver's damming behavior. These beaver ponds are going to help replenish the aquifer, potentially elevate and or stabilize the water table, effectively drought-proofing the landscape is the way that I like to kind of think about it. That is certainly another point that is more relevant in some parts of the country more than others. Also, beavers, it's kind of counterintuitive to think about it like this, but while they create flooding on a small scale, they actually help to mitigate larger scale flooding from these heavier storms that we're seeing, larger, more severe rain events. And so they actually, they're slowing down that water. You can also think about when beaver ponds are storing groundwater, that water can be used for various things, such as agriculture. And in general, these ponds are also just wetlands that are increasing the biodiversity, providing habitat for lots of other species, sometimes including endangered species, sometimes including those other species that we really do value, like trout or salmon, for example. And I do have a quick little video to share here. Actually, it's on the next slide. So this one doesn't have, here we go. I don't think the sound is working, but there are captions. What we're looking at here is just a little stop motion video about how beavers create a wetland and the effect of those wetlands during dun, 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 the wildfire. Yay. So now we're just going to watch it a million times. How do I get out of this slide now? Here we go. Okay. So the one other point on the previous slide was that oh, it won't let me go back. Anyway, the beaver wetlands, they help to slow down the spread of wildfires, as you could see from that video. And they also, those wetlands provide refuges for other wildlife during a wildfire. It's often the only wet spot where other wildlife can come for a safe place to wait out the fire. And that video, by the way, was made by Dr. Emily Fairfax. She is an eco-hydrologist out in California, and she does some really great scholarly work on specifically how beavers are changing the landscape and kind of what their benefits are. So this one is a little bit kind of less on a smaller scale, but beaver foraging behavior also helps to promote plant growth. And a lot of the species that they really like re-sprout from the stumps. And beavers also sometimes dig channels to, so the reason that they do that is so that they can kind of float trees back, or so that they have a little waterway to access trees or plants farther from the main pond. And these channels also provide habitat for so many little larvae and eggs. I've seen a video kind of go down into one, and it's just like teeming with tadpoles and lots of life. So that is, now I'm just having trouble with my slides. Okay, I'll pause here. Are there any questions at this point? I'm checking the chat. Beavers in Florida. That's not a question, but a great comment. I'm from Florida myself, so I am very interested in this. There are beavers in northern Florida. I just read about a really cool thing recently where someone got camera trap footage of an alligator feeding on a beaver carcass, and whether or not the alligator killed the beaver is, I don't know if they know that or not, but certainly that's one of the reasons why, one of the common reasons people say there are not beavers in Florida. Although curious, because there are other mammals like otters down into Florida where there are alligators too. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. Yes, it is. I love that video. Emily Fairfax is great. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but she's full of awesome beaver knowledge. Okay, we're getting in now to the coexisting part of things. And admittedly, beavers cause lots of problems. So we've seen why they're very important, but I am not ever going to deny that they can cause problems. So two of those problems, it typically falls into two categories: tree felling and flooding. And flooding is kind of the bigger issue, especially on a larger scale. As you can imagine, when there's flooding on the roads, this becomes a safety issue for people traveling to and from their homes. It involves departments of transportation, and it just becomes a much larger problem, potentially. So we're going to talk more about each of these in more detail. I apologize for this boring slide, but what we have done at HBCF is to kind of break this down and to provide for each of those two problems all of the options and kind of to evaluate them based on these criteria. So is it a legal option? Is it humane? Is it effective in the short term, effective in the long term? And is it affordable or cost effective? And I'm not going to go through every single kind of little section of these tables here. But what you can see is that there are, for example, I'll focus on the flooding one down here at the bottom. There are a range of options for dealing with a beaver-caused flood, ranging from lethal trapping to just accepting the flooding and leaving it alone, which obviously is not an option for some people. For some it is. And what you can see here is that kind of the shortcomings of each of these options. So the red text shows that lethal trapping, it's effective in the short term, it is legal, it is relatively affordable, but it is not humane and it's not effective in the long term. And what that means is that you can trap out a beaver 1 year and you're creating a hole, a vacuum, in a place where clearly beavers have deemed it a good quality habitat. And so as long as there's a population nearby of more beavers dispersing, you're going to be dealing with that solution again and again, year after year after year. So that's why it's not a long-term solution, for example. Relocation is simply not legal in Virginia and a lot of the states here on the East Coast. That relocation is more of a thing out west, and even then it is kind of like Plan C because it's very involved, it's very expensive. It can only happen during certain times of the year. So, you know, a lot of people just say, well, move the beavers. It's never that simple, unfortunately. Removing the dam, again, is one of those examples of something that you can do, but you'll be doing it over and over and over again, because if you've ever tried this strategy, you know how quickly beavers will rebuild. And so the two kind of strategies, non-lethal strategies that we recommend at HBCF is fencing, painting or wrapping trees when it comes to tree chewing problems, and then installing flow devices where appropriate in the case of flooding problems. So we're going to delve into those two options now. So protecting the trees is a relatively simpler thing, unless of course you have just like a ton of trees. There are different strategies that you will read about for protecting trees, including wrapping them with fencing, painting them with a mixture of latex and sand paint, and then and sometimes even with other things. But the method that we recommend is to wrap it with this galvanized fencing, 14 gauge, welded wire at least 4 feet tall. You can see all the kind of the details of those materials that we recommend here on this graphic. This is a picture of exactly what we buy. You can get it at Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply. It's very widely available and costs around 80 bucks for 100 feet of fencing. And then the tricks are to leave enough space in between the tree trunk and the fence. A gap we suggest of about a foot all the way around. And this means that A, the beavers aren't going to be able to push up onto the trunk like in the photo down here on the bottom left of the screen. And this is what's making this a long-term solution. So the trees can grow and grow and grow for years and you have the tree protected. Also, it's important to secure this seam. So wherever you kind of bring the fencing together, make sure that that is well secured. I've seen videos of beavers just busting through the seams on these fences, and also to secure around the base of the fence with little landscape pins so that beavers cannot push up and underneath. And so that is just kind of a really brief run through on protecting the trees. The painting method, there's been actually some research out lately that the paint would not be healthy for the beaver to ingest. I don't necessarily think they're eating it, they're just kind of chewing it off the tree. But it is a less long-term solution because as the tree grows, you have to repaint the tree, and it's just a more high maintenance strategy. So that's why we recommend fencing. And don't put it too close to the trees. Don't use chicken wire. Beavers can chew right through some of those flimsier fencing materials. Moving on to flooding as a problem. I'm checking on my time here. So there are a number of different flow device designs. You may have also heard these referred to as beaver deceivers or caster masters, clumps and pond levelers. There's all kinds of names, all kinds of designs. But kind of two of the basic ones that I just want to introduce you to today are the culvert protector design. So that is, of course, when you have a culvert running perhaps underneath a road or through a berm. And if we think about what a culvert looks like to a beaver, it's just a leak in an already existing dam. So beavers are very attracted to culverts. If you work anywhere near this kind of sphere of transportation or kind of road maintenance, any of this, you will know that beavers are attracted to culverts like magnets. And one of the very effective and relatively simple designs that tends to work in this case is a trapezoidal fence around the culvert. So this design, what it does is the beavers will actually probably keep damming because they can feel the flow of the water moving through the culvert. They can hear the sound of moving water in a lot of cases. And so they are going to keep damming along maybe this fence close to the culvert. But what the design of the fence does is it pushes them out away from the culvert, and water is still flowing through even this, this wide end of the fence. In the case of a beaver dam, where you want to just kind of be able to lower the water level and keep it at a level that is deemed appropriate for the landowner or for you, you can place a pipe through the beaver dam and then run it. The kind of standard distance for that pipe is 40 feet long. And then you're going to cage the intake of that pipe. So basically, water's moving through the dam, but beavers don't know where it's moving through. And even if they do, they can't dam it up because it's protected in this little cage here. And so then you sink the pipe down under the water and you place it through the dam at the level where you want the water to be. And so there is a picture here of a flow device. I was working with the Potomac Valley Audubon Society. They just had, so they have 4 preserves in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. And they had 2 of their 4 preserves, beavers showed up for the first time in many years just within the last year, which is very interesting. And so they installed one of these flow devices. It looks very shallow here in this picture because they had just completely dug out all of the, they had just completely unclogged the culverts, basically. So that water level is back up right now. The beavers have definitely dammed around this cage, but of course water can still flow through. So that's just kind of a quick intro into flow devices. I also want to point out that there is a company in outside of Baltimore, I believe, called Ecotone that does these installations. And then the Beaver Institute is another nonprofit organization up in the Northeast that they have a training program called Beaver Core. If you would be interested in learning about flow devices, learning how to install them, and then bringing that knowledge and skill back here to the Northern Virginia area, it is very needed. And I can hook anyone who's interested up with the folks at the Beaver Institute to complete that program. So basically, we need more people doing this kind of work here in the Mid-Atlantic area. And then finally, if you are going to DIY a flow device, and we definitely we recommend that you give it a try if you're going in with the right expectations and the right kind of mindset about it. So one of the kind of dangers of doing a do-it-yourself flow device is that if it doesn't work, people have gone to just tell all their neighbors like flow devices don't work. When in reality, you know, there are people who have been installing flow devices for decades that are still learning new things. And every single site is completely different. And you have to have the willingness to tweak your design. You have to just be willing that it might not work right away. It's going to involve kind of this process of trial and error. And so we do not discourage anyone from kind of giving it a try to build one of these devices yourself if you have a problem. They are, like I said, relatively simple. The materials are easy to get. But if you know someone or if you are going to do it yourself, just know that it's a process. It's not a just one-time quick, easy fix necessarily. It definitely depends on each scenario in each spot. And there are variations on these two designs, just probably countless variations, depending on exactly what the situation is. Okay. This is the anthropologist in me just wanting us to step back for a quick second and understand that human-wildlife conflict, the definition that I kind of like is that it's an interaction between humans and wildlife that results in negative effects on either the humans or the wildlife on each other's needs. And we tend to think of this as a dichotomy, conflict and coexistence, but it's actually a spectrum. So any example of a beaver problem could fall anywhere on the spectrum. And the threshold for someone's tolerance to kind of a beaver problem is constantly changing. So it changes in different parts of the country. It changes even within one person, depending on the day or whatever is going on. So I like to just remind people to think of it more on like this spectrum. And of course, what we are aiming for is towards this coexistence. But again, with beavers, it's not always so simple. And what I like to kind of think about is that if you've observed nature, you know that it's always changing, right? And it's supposed to be always changing. But when we haven't had this species on our properties, let's say for many years, perhaps in your whole lifetime, you think about it in one way, and then the beaver shows up and changes everything. And so I like to just say that beavers teach us to embrace change. And I think that because of such the kind of the large scale changes that the beaver can have, it's another reason why trapping is just such a still a popular way of managing beaver conflict because people, there's a quote, people don't like to be outdone by a rodent. We are still kind of grappling with the fact that beavers are coming back. That's kind of a dramatic way of saying it. They've always been here, but their numbers are increasing, and that they make these changes that we just don't have as much control over as we're used to. And so that is my little theoretical kind of anthropological view of the human-beaver interaction. If you don't have a beaver problem, yay, lucky you, you can still contribute to the efforts for kind of improving beaver coexistence by learning about beaver behavior, which you all are doing right now, learning about the benefits they provide, sharing that information with others, considering the language you use to speak about beavers. So I hear a lot the terms nuisance, animal, and pest. And even if we don't agree with those words, but we're using them, we're perpetuating those ideas that they are simply a problem, and it's not very much more nuanced than that. And so we can reframe our thinking, and this is easier said than done, of course, but it's just something to think about, reframing the way that we think about beavers potentially as partners in stream restoration, or as partners in creating wetland habitat for other species, or in partners of kind of even mitigating some of these effects of climate change that we're seeing. And so I like to just share this quote from Enos Mills. He wrote a book called In Beaver World from 1913. It's an incredible book. And basically what this quote is just saying is that beavers have changed constantly over time to survive, to kind of live around us. And I just like to pose the idea that maybe we could think about it as showing them that same respect and maybe changing a little bit about ourselves in order for both of us to keep thriving. So we offer beaver school programs. So in addition to working with landowners, we do work with students of all ages to learn about beavers, learn about why they're important, learn about water quality, all that good stuff. And if you are interested in community science, there is an app called iBeaver, which one of the board of directors of HBCF helped to develop this app. It's very user-friendly. If you observe any evidence of beavers out on a hike, for example, you can use this app to report that, and then it maps it on what is called the Castor Mapper here. So that is a really fun thing to explore if you are into kind of science, techie stuff and community science. I also want to plug here for Beavercon 2022. So there is a conference every other year here on the East Coast. It happens right outside of Baltimore, not too far away, and it's happening next month. I'm on the planning committee for it. Registration is still open, and the theme this year is building climate resilience. So if you want, 3 more days of learning about beavers and how amazing they can be, what the problems they can cause, please join us at Beavercon. And I also like to share some of my favorite beaver books. So if this presentation has kind of just inspired you to maybe want to learn a little bit more about beavers, these are a few of my favorite books. Eager by Ben Goldfarb is a wonderful place to start. Once They Were Hats by Frances Backhouse is great if you're interested more in kind of the history of the fur trade, that side of things. If you're more interested in the ecology of it, Saving the Damned is an amazing book. And then if you want a little bit of everything, read The Beaver Manifesto by Glenys Hood. Those are my favorite beaver reads. And thank you all so much for listening. And I am going to, first of all, you can follow along with HBCF and our work. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Coexist with Beavers, and our website is coexistwithbeavers.org. There you can find information about our education programs, about our cost share program for landowners. So please visit our website. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and take questions.
Yes, Allison, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Bev. I can't get my camera to work in this new app. So
That's okay.
So we have beavers for the first time this year in a very long time. And we have a dam, a very big lodge, or it looks big to me. And everything was fine until the water got over the trail. So I'm sure there were lots of calls.
Over the trail?
Yes, and
Okay.
what I want to point out is this landowner is Fairfax County. So it's in the South Run Stream Valley.
Okay.
And at that point, what I can determine that they did was they brought equipment in and just tore down some of the dam. Very quickly, the dam, of course, as you pointed out, got rebuilt. So do you know what Fairfax County's policy is on?
I definitely don't, I don't know or want to speak for the county. I think this is one of those tricky situations where it's also kind of dealt with on a case-by-case basis. I do know that removing dams, it can actually work. So if a county or even just an individual landowner destroys a dam enough, it could actually just deter the beavers from rebuilding in that area. They would move on. But in a lot of cases, it doesn't work. Destroying the dams, and that was in the little table that I showed. It's still a non-lethal management strategy. And so, it's not one that actually, let me rephrase that. We do sometimes recommend it, only for a short-term solution. Like if you need to drop your water level right now because you've got a problem and, it takes a little longer to implement some of these more involved methods. We do occasionally recommend that just for a quick solution, but yeah, beavers rebuild really quickly. Counties, so again, one of the reasons that HBCF exists is to kind of help, even at the county and the larger agency level, people understand what the options are and to understand that, there are even, and I didn't talk too much about this, but there are economic benefits to installing a flow device. So there are multiple studies. There's one even from another part of Virginia where, you know, a city saves thousands and thousands of dollars after installing the flow device. And I can, I'm trying to think of how I could share that with everyone. It's like a journal article. But, you know, I think over time, part of the work of this organization is just to get the word out there that there are perhaps more effective strategies that are longer term. And so we want to be able to work with counties and the larger agencies like that too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Allison. Deirdre Pistakini here. I had the question in the chat, but I thought I would just ask it in person.
Yes, there's a lot in the chat. I may have lost it.
No, that's okay. I wanted to ask because I was once told that generally beavers will stay in one particular area up to about 5 years, essentially until they eat themselves out of the food source, and then they'll move on. Is that kind of an accurate generalization, or does it just depend on geographically the area? I'm guessing it is factors are geographic area and how big the wetland area is. I just wanted to know what your perspective is on that.
Yes, that is one of the things that I hear a lot, like, oh, beavers, they'll just kind of eat everything around them, and then they've kind of exploited their own habitat, and then they have to move somewhere else and do it there. I think it's more complex than that. I definitely know that there are places where beavers have been living, you know, kind of for decades without moving on. This is one of the times where we have to kind of consider that, you know, a lot of these plant species are resprouting, they're regenerating. So in a sense, there are, you know, certain types of vegetation that beavers are almost kind of farming as they live in a single area. I do think that in a region as developed as ours, that beavers probably move around a little bit more because there are just fewer trees, for example, just more, you know, more development surrounding these wetland areas where beavers have no choice. So definitely the answer to your question is that it depends. That 5 years number that you quoted is not something that I'm familiar with as kind of being, you know, accepted in any sort of like scientific way. But it really does depend. So one of the very first things that I do, for example, we do site visits for landowners. They say, I have a beaver problem, and then I make sure that it's actually a beaver, and then I will go visit properties. And one of the things the first things I have to do is to decide, is this a beaver that's just dispersed, that's just passing through, or is this a newly arrived, it's a pair, they're going to establish, you know, a colony here. And looking at the surrounding vegetation, looking at the available, kind of the quantity of available trees surrounding what water is there is one of the big things that I use to figure that out. So, you know, beavers could be at an area for even less than a year if there's just not enough vegetation, and they tried to make it work and they had to move on. Okay. So it's a really nuanced thing, but it does, I love when people are thinking about that, because it means you're thinking about all of the other kind of ecological factors that play into where beavers are, how long they're going to be there, and how they're going to change the landscape.
Great. Thank you, Allison.
Mm-hmm.
Allison, I have just a comment. This is Willy Wood with the Conservation District. Yeah. And the idea of your clip that shows how the vegetation stand changes as the pond is being established is a pretty interesting one. And it's good for the environment. However, sometimes from our office, we get calls from folks who feel like they're losing their property because of the ponding effect that's taking place, where the ones had like a nice calm walking area is no longer a walking area for them. And that's one of the concerns. However, I feel of significant economic impact is the invasion of stream restoration areas by beavers, where trees would have been planted to make sure the vegetative stand is good to create the habitat that's necessary. And as we know, stream restoration work is very expensive. And only for 3 or 4 years down the road to have a family of beavers show up and trees begin to come down. And restoring or replacing those trees become pretty expensive because accessibility is no longer as easy as it was when the stream was being restored, etc., etc. So that is one challenge that sometimes we get in the Southeast with beavers coming in.
Yeah, I have worked with some folks on protecting, trees that are planted for that reason, riparian buffers or restoration projects. You can certainly protect, little tiny saplings or little new plantings with the fencing methods that I talked about on that one slide. In an area where you're working on kind of a larger scale project, sometimes, so this is less practical, but sometimes we would recommend just exclusion fencing for that purpose. Just to kind of, and that can be tricky, especially if you're trying to like cross a stream with it. But there are ways to kind of protect those plantings kind of from the beginning, kind of maybe anticipate that like beaver, this is also good food for a beaver. But on the point of stream restoration, kind of on a broader scope, I've read that beavers, they will restore a stream in a third of the time that it will take kind of like a human project, a stream restoration project, and for a fraction of the cost. And so beavers are actually out west. This is more of a thing out west, again, because for lots of factors. But beavers are being used for the purpose of stream restoration in a lot of places. They're actually being, like relocated from a place where they're considered a problem to this more remote area where there is, maybe a really heavily eroded stream. And the beavers are just transforming those landscapes for the better. And so this is a great example of one of those cases where, we're talking about stream restoration, and in some cases, beavers can be a problem, and in some cases, they can be the solution. And that's just a great example of how complex this all can be. Thanks for sharing that, Willy. Any other questions?
Allison, how dangerous is it to have beavers in very close proximity? So we have a whole lodge underneath our dock, and my wife likes to paddleboard. I like to swim. They're pretty territorial. Like if we're there and they're out, they'll come out and slap their tails. Just a little curious about that. And then a second question is, trapping is really low right now because the pelts aren't really worth anything. And I was just reading that the castrum is really valuable, like maybe 90 or $100 a pound, when the pelt is only worth 10 or 20 bucks if you could even sell it. Like why is that? Why is the castoreum so valuable? So one is safety and proximity, and the second is just a curious question about the glands.
Yeah. So when you say safety, or like, are they dangerous? You mean for like your own personal safety, right? Like not your dock or anything like that.
No, they're
Okay.
already chewing down all the trees, and we're wrapping them in fence, like you said. Or just like if we're in the water, like is a beaver going to attack somebody?
How long have they been there?
I don't know. I just bought the house, but it looks like they've been here for at least a couple of years.
Okay. So in my personal opinion, you don't have too much to worry about. Beavers, they definitely are tail slapping because they feel that you are a threat to them. So the tail slap is the behavior that potentially might scare a predator away, but also it communicates with the other beavers in the colony that like, hey, there's a threat nearby. You should observe that over time, as you use your pond more for swimming, for paddleboarding, that they should become habituated to your presence to an extent, so that they'll start to tail slap less. I have heard the occasional story of a beaver becoming aggressive towards people, but that is pretty rare. I can think of one example, I think from somewhere in Fairfax years ago.
Well, yeah, there was a lady on our lake who got attacked by a rabid beaver.
Yes, and a rabid
And a friend of
beaver.
mine had to beat it off her with a paddle.
Yes, and that is one of those very just like rare freak
Yeah.
accident cases. Of course, if you have any inkling that the beaver is rabid, I would take more care. But you know, I have been around beaver ponds where, you know, and places like Huntley Meadows, for example, where people are constantly around. The beavers do get used to people. And you know, if you're new to your property, maybe the previous owners didn't use the water as much, and so they're kind of just having to adjust to you being there. It's not. I would definitely just keep an eye on their behavior, but I don't want to tell you don't swim, don't you know, don't paddleboard. They're not dangerous, scary creatures for the most part. There was one man in Belarus in the 90s who was killed by a beaver. So, and that's the only one I know of. And he was like trying to wrangle it for a picture. So. Oh, and your castorium question. Sorry, you had a two-part question. So yes, when I speak about trapping, I mostly am speaking just about trapping to get rid of a nuisance. I don't know of any trappers that are kind of making any money off of the pelt or even the castorium. I'm curious where kind of where you read that. Castorium definitely used to be in larger demand, to my understanding. It was even used in, it was like used in perfumes, it was used in some vanilla flavorings. But my understanding is that that is kind of no longer, it's no longer used for those purposes. And so I don't know why castorium would be such a high price right now. Where did you think that?
I was just curious. Like one of my fishing guides up in Pennsylvania on the Susquehanna
Mhm.
has trapped on and off for decades, and
Mhm.
oh my gosh, it is inhumane. But that's a completely separate question. But I was asking him a couple weeks ago because there's a lot of beaver activity up there.
Mhm.
And he said, yeah, nobody's trapping because they can't make any money on it. So while you were talking, I went to do a little research on it on trappingtoday.com to just read up
Okay.
on like what's the price of a beaver pelt.
Right.
It ain't much.
No, it's not.
But it's fascinating to read it from a trapper's perspective, like how they view this whole thing. It's totally different than what you just talked about, by the way.
Yeah, so trapping has like the concept of trapping has changed so much, right? Like it used to be like a huge moneymaker, and now it's basically just pest control. But the castorium piece is what I don't know about.
Yeah, I don't know either. All right. Well,
I'm
thanks.
looking into that. Thank you.
This is great. Thanks.
I've got a question here. Thanks everyone. Yeah, so this is about Alaska. I paddled 150 miles in the White Mountains, a river called Beaver Creek, and I must have seen 100 beavers. But what was interesting is not a single dam. They were all the lodges were on the banks. And I'm just curious why, we paddled no problem the entire length of it. Not a single dam. Is it because of the cold water, or what do you think's going on there?
I think that in the case when there are beavers and no dams, it's because the beavers don't have to build dams. So this is a ton of work for them, a ton of effort, a ton of energy expended to build and then maintain the dam. So it's not just build a dam and then just like you've got your pond. It's build a dam and then constantly maintaining it and adding to it and kind of tweaking the water level to their satisfaction. And I'm guessing, and so I've never been to Alaska, but I'm guessing that this Beaver Creek is wide enough and deep enough already that building a dam wouldn't really add much to their ability to be able to survive in that river. So the only reason that a beaver builds a dam, remember, is because they want a larger body of water with a deep enough water for them to be safe. And so, again, on those like larger rivers, that's a waste of their effort. The dam is probably going to blow out by just kind of the current from the river, the size of it.
Yes.
And so they just don't need a dam. And it's kind of cool that you paddled like that much of a river, and there's just all of these, I call them bank beavers. Not that there's any real distinction, but just they don't need dams. Good for them. They can make do with the river and just kind of lodge into the bank.
Thanks.
Alison, I have a question, sort of going on the lines of what you have been talking about. What are sort of the criteria that the beavers use to make the selection of the choices? This goes a little bit on the question that you had before. What exactly makes them do? Why do they come to areas that they don't have sufficient water?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So you're asking like what makes a great beaver spot? What are the habitat kind of characteristics that they're looking for?
What do they make them build the dams?
Yeah.
What are the criteria that they use? Why they choose, this particular side of the river versus the other side, or the proximities, or all of these elements that makes the decision for them.
Yes. Great question. A lot when I think of beavers in our like Northern Virginia, our region, a lot of them are using human-made ponds at this point. And so they have basically found a spot where the water is deep enough. There is an existing pond where, again, they don't have to maintain a dam. So the beavers that I observed, the very first colony of beavers that I learned all about, they did not build and maintain a single large dam either, because they were on a human-made pond. And they built lots of lodges, and I've got some theories about that. But so they were using, a berm that was built by people as their dam, essentially, and using that pond. But when a beaver is kind of dispersing from its lodge where it was born, looking for a new habitat, what they're generally looking for, if there is not an existing pond for them to work with, is a relatively small stream on a very gentle slope. So small streams with low gradient, and of course a lot of trees and vegetation near the banks. They need not only food, but of course building material if they're going to start to establish a wetland there. But I have seen beavers in some wild places. I mean, right, like just below, what is it, Sandstone Falls on the New River. I mean, it's like you can hear the roar of the waterfall, and then there's a beaver just downstream of the falls, because they found this spot where the water is kind of pooling up naturally, moving slow enough that they just built a lodge right in the middle. And again, no dam in that case, because the river is plenty deep there. They need building materials, they need food, they need water of 3 feet in depth. And if they don't have that already, they're going to create it for themselves by building those dams. I wish I could speak more to kind of the types of food that beavers prefer and don't prefer. There are certainly, they have favorites like willow and aspen and alder. if you hear someone say that beavers will never eat this plant, let me know, because every time I hear that, I also see it like totally contradicted. I've seen beavers take down pines and all kinds of things. So I think they're less, they're less picky about vegetation type. I think they do also eat some of the non-native species, or at least build with. I've seen them cut down autumn olive and ailanthus trees. So yeah, they just need, I think I'm answering your question. They just need enough food, enough building material, and deep enough water. And they can create that themselves even from a small stream.
Allison,
Great.
we
Thank
all,
you.
oh, sorry. Allison, I know they're amazing engineers. They'd make great lumberjacks. But I've watched their activity with the trees out at Huntley Meadows Park, and it is amazing working on the tree, how they know exactly where to chew, how it's going to fall. Is this intuitive behavior with the beavers, or is it learned behavior passed on through generations? It's amazing what they do.
Yes, I agree. That is like one of the $1 million beaver questions. So I can speak to a lot of the behaviors are both, I would say, a mix, of course, of innate and then learned behaviors. The kits do stay with their parents and their generation older siblings, let's say the yearlings, for a couple of years. So they are certainly learning some of these things. As to whether or not they can kind of control which way a tree falls, that is like a big debate in the beaver world. There are some people who say that they can, they've just seen evidence of that. I think the In Beaver World book that I quoted from in my presentation, I think he was kind of very systematic in his observations, and he determined that such a majority % of the trees were actually falling in the right direction, like towards the water. And then there's other scientists that actually don't think that that's the case. There are plenty of trees that beavers chew down that they never use at all. So they'll just take a tree down and then walk away, and no one knows why. There are lots of trees that they chew down that they actually will get like caught in vines that are kind of up in the canopy, so that that's a wasted effort. So how much they are in control of that is up for a lot of debate. But I tend to err on the side of giving beavers a little more credit than we're used to giving them, while also keeping in mind that their brains are the size of a walnut. So
Some people would say people's brains are that size. Sorry, little humor.
I'm not
Thank
very
you,
good at
Allison.
giving straight answers today, unfortunately. This is the nature of the beaver conversation.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, Allison, hi, this is Carolyn Smith. I've got a question.
Hi.
So when 2-year-old beavers leave the family lodge to look for their own territory, how do they look for it? Do they travel strictly along stream beds or waterways, or will they travel on land too if they have to?
They will try to stick to waterways for sure. That is like their safety net. Although of course deep water, so those smaller streams, they'll try to stick to the water. But beavers can travel overland for longer distances than people realize, I think. I read that beavers will travel up to 50 kilometers from their natal lodge. So if you have seen a beaver walk on land, they're pretty awkward. They're certainly not as graceful as they are in the water, and it is more dangerous for them. They're more vulnerable to a lot of those predators that we mentioned. But yeah, they'll travel overland, and more often than we would think, I think, successful with that. They tend to move at night. And so a lot of those land predators are diurnal. And so, yeah, they'll travel on land.
So if it's a really shallow little creek, they wouldn't really get much benefit from following that little tiny creek.
Maybe
except
not.
that supposedly it will take them to a bigger creek or river at some point.
Right. They're potentially following the streams to other good spots. but they can dig. So if they're in kind of like a, maybe a foot of water, let's say, and they need a safe place to maybe spend a few days, they could build a little bank den potentially. But yeah, they're certainly more vulnerable in those cases.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Do beavers get killed from falling trees? I missed that one. The answer is yes, occasionally, which is another kind of point on the argument of they're not totally in control of the direction. I have heard of that happening, but I think it's pretty rare. Beavers back in the tidal basin. Ooh, this is a good question. And maybe then this could be the last question, I guess, if we have nothing else. The effect of the beaver population being reduced from 400 million to 50 million is a great question, David. Thank you. This is another one of kind of the big questions, right? I mean, basically what we're seeing is land where, I walked around Fauquier County with, not the whole county, of course. I was in Fauquier County. I was walking around with a beaver expert, Skip Lyle. He's based in Vermont. He has a company just doing this kind of work. And he's been doing it he's like one of the longest in the game. And he was just pointing at every little spot, like that used to be a beaver wetland, that used to be a beaver wetland, that used to be a beaver wetland. I mean, the scale of beaver habitat in North America was just so much more. And I think what really suffers is the water, the aquifer, a lot of wetland species just not having habitat anymore. The beaver wetlands also create, this is something I didn't necessarily talk about, but like nesting and stopover habitat for migrating birds and waterfowl. This is a question that I think beaver folks could just get together and like riff on for hours. But it's so important to think about. And, like I said, we're never going to get back to 400 million beavers. There's not enough space for that many beavers anymore. But can we maximize the available space that we do have to maximize those benefits in the space that we have left for beavers? And that's why coexistence is so important. So thank you all so much. I think we've wrapped up all the questions.
I think that's all of them. Allison, thank you so much for joining us today, talking to us about this human-wildlife conflict issue and how we can all be beaver buddies and learn more about these amazing critters. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and I hope everyone has a lovely weekend. Go outside, go for a walk, maybe see your own beaver, and we'll see you at our next Green Breakfast.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.